They thought she was just an old woman with trembling hands and a quiet voice, someone whose pain had already faded with age. But pain doesn't age. It waits. And on one ordinary morning, when Grandma finally stood up for herself, a lifetime of silence broke, and the truth she revealed would change everything forever. She used to wake before the sun, even now, even at 74. Her body no longer needed to, but her memories did. Sleep never stayed long with her. It slipped away quietly, the same way her laughter had years ago. When her eyes opened in the half-dark, she lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar creaks of the old house, the ticking clock on the wall, and the distant hum of the city beginning its day. Her name was Margaret, though most people called her Grandma, as if that single word could hold all she had been, all she had lost. She pushed herself upright slowly, joints protesting, breath shallow for a moment. Pain lived in her bones now, but it was a polite pain, predictable, not like the other kind, not like the memories that came without warning, sharp and unforgiving. She swung her feet onto the cold floor and whispered, "Another day," as if saying it out loud might give her strength. The mirror in the hallway caught her reflection as she passed. White hair pulled back neatly, deep lines etched into her face like a map of places she'd survived. Her eyes were still sharp, though. People missed that. They always did. They saw the softness, the wrinkles, the slow steps. They didn't see the woman who had once been fearless, who had endured things no one should, who had learned early that silence was sometimes the only way to survive in the kitchen. She boiled water for tea, her hands steady despite the memories creeping closer. The smell of the tea leaves reminded her of her mother, of mornings long ago when life had still felt full of promise. She pushed the thought away. Today was not for remembering gently. Today was heavier, though she didn't yet know why. Her daughter-in-law, Linda, had asked her to come over that afternoon. The message had been short, polite on the surface, but something about it sat wrong in Margaret's chest. Linda's politeness had always carried sharp edges beneath it, like glass wrapped in silk. Margaret had learned to recognize the tone. Years ago, she drank her tea slowly, staring out the window at the small patch of sky visible between buildings. She told herself not to worry. She had told herself that many times before, and many times. She had been wrong. By noon, she was dressed in her best cardigan. The blue one her late husband had once said brought out her eyes. Thinking of him always brought a mix of comfort and ache. He had been her anchor, her quiet protector. When he died, something in the world had shifted, leaving her exposed in ways she hadn't felt since she was a girl. The bus ride to Linda's house was uneventful. Margaret sat near the window, watching people hurry past with their lives tightly clutched in their hands. She wondered if any of them carried secrets as heavy as hers. Probably. Everyone did, in one way or another. Linda's house was large, modern, spotless in a way that made Margaret uneasy. It felt more like a showroom than a home. Linda opened the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Come in, Mom," she said, though the words sounded rehearsed. Margaret stepped inside, her shoes clicking softly on the polished floor. Her son, David, was at work, Linda said. The grandchildren were at school. It was just the two of them. The air felt thick with unspoken things. They sat at the kitchen table. Linda poured coffee for herself but didn't offer any to Margaret. It was a small thing. It always started with small things. "I'll get straight to the point," Linda said, folding her hands. "We've been talking, David and I." Margaret nodded, bracing herself. "We think it might be time for you to consider other living." Arrangements. The words landed like stones. I don't understand, Margaret said quietly. Linda sighed, as if burdened. You're alone. The house is old. Maintenance is expensive. And honestly, it's a lot for us to worry about. Worry? Margaret almost smiled at the word. I manage just fine, she said. I always have. Linda's eyes hardened slightly. That may be how you see it. But things change. You're not young anymore. There it was. The sentence Margaret had heard in 1,000 forms over the years. She felt something stir inside her, old and restless. Linda continued, her voice calm but cold. There's a facility. Very nice. Other people your age. It would be easier for everyone. For everyone, Margaret repeated softly. Linda leaned forward. We need to sell your house to help pay for it. The room seemed to tilt. Margaret's fingers curled around each other under the table. My house is not for sale, she said. Linda's smile vanished. You don't really have a choice. Something snapped then. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, internal break, like a thread pulled too far. I raised your husband in that house, Margaret said, her voice trembling despite herself. I buried my husband from that house. It is my life. Linda shrugged. Sentiment doesn't pay bills. Margaret looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just cruelty, but a familiar kind of disregard. The same dismissiveness she had known decades ago. From different faces, different voices. People who thought they could take because she would not fight back. They talked for another hour. Or maybe it was only minutes. Time blurred. Linda laid out plans, papers, suggestions. Each word pressed down on Margaret's chest until breathing felt like work. When she finally stood to leave, Linda said, think about it. But don't take too long. Outside, the air felt sharp and cold, though it was spring. Margaret's legs shook as she walked to the bus stop. She sat on the bench and stared at her hands. Thin and veined, hands that had held babies, cooked meals, wiped tears, shielded herself once upon a time. She did not cry. Crying had never changed anything for her. Instead, something else began to rise. Anger, yes, but also clarity. That night, sleep did not come at all. Memories flooded in, uninvited. She was 12 again, standing in a dark hallway, heart pounding. She was 22, learning to stay quiet. She was 40, choosing endurance over escape. She had survived by bending, by yielding, by staying small, and now they wanted her to disappear politely into a room with beige walls and scheduled meals. In the early hours of the morning, as dawn crept in through the curtains, Margaret made a decision. It felt strange, almost frightening, to choose something for herself after so many years. But beneath the fear was something steady. She would not be moved. If they thought she was weak, they were wrong. And if they pushed her, they would learn just how much a lifetime of silence could turn into something else entirely. Margaret did not tell anyone about the decision she made that morning. She carried it quietly, the way she had carried so many things in her life, tucked deep inside where no one could question it or try to take it away. But this time, it felt different. This time, the silence wasn't weakness. It was preparation. The days that followed moved slowly on the surface, but inside her, something was shifting. She went about her routines, watering the plants, folding laundry, walking to the corner shop for bread, but every small action felt deliberate, as if she were reclaiming pieces of herself one by one. She noticed things she hadn't in years. The way sunlight warmed the living room floor in the afternoon, The faint scratch on the dining table from when David was little and had tried to carve his name with a spoon. These were not just objects. They were witnesses, proof that her life had mattered. On the third day after visiting Linda, a letter arrived. Margaret recognized the handwriting immediately. David's. Her son had always written carefully, as if afraid of making mistakes. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time before opening it, her fingers resting on the envelope, her heart heavy with both love and disappointment. The letter was gentle in tone, but firm in message. He talked about concern, about safety, about what was best. He avoided words like sell and move, but they hovered between the lines. Unmistakable. He said Linda was only trying to help. He asked Margaret not to make things difficult. She read it twice, then a third time. By the end, her hands were trembling, not with fear, but with a familiar, bitter recognition. Even now, even as a grown man, her son did not see her. He saw a problem to be solved, a responsibility to be managed. I did not raise you to be afraid of standing up, she whispered to the empty room. That night, she dreamed of her childhood home. In the dream, she was small again, hiding behind a door while voices argued in the other room. She remembered the lesson she had learned early. Stay quiet, stay invisible, and the storm might pass faster. That lesson had kept her alive once, but it had also stolen parts of her, piece by piece. She woke with tears on her face and resolve in her chest. The next morning, she pulled out a box from the back of her closet. It was old, edges softened with time. Inside were papers she hadn't looked at in years. Deeds, letters, bank statements, and beneath them, something else, a small notebook wrapped in cloth. Her journal. She hadn't planned to keep one. It had started decades ago, after a night she had never spoken of, a night that had changed the shape of her life. Writing had been the only way to breathe afterward. Over the years, the journal had become a place where truth lived, uncensored and raw. Her hands shook as she opened it. The first pages were faded, ink smudged with age. She read words written by a younger version of herself, a woman who had been terrified, angry, confused, and painfully alone. She remembered the fear of not being believed, the shame that had never belonged to her but had settled on her anyway. She closed the notebook gently. No, not yet, she told herself. But soon. Margaret knew now that Linda's pressure was not just about convenience. It was about control. The house was valuable, the land even more so. She had suspected it before but dismissed it, not wanting to believe that her own family would see her as an obstacle. Now, the truth felt unavoidable. She made a phone call that afternoon, one she had never imagined making. The woman on the other end listened quietly as Margaret explained her situation. There was no judgment in her voice, only professionalism and patience. You have rights, the woman said, more than you realize. Those words echoed in Margaret's mind long after the call ended. In the days that followed, Linda's messages increased. Some were sweet, almost apologetic. Others were curt, irritated. David called once, his voice tight. Why are you being so stubborn? He asked. Margaret closed her eyes. Why do you think wanting to stay in my own home is stubborn? There was a pause. We're just trying to help. Help doesn't feel like being pushed, she replied. David sighed. Linda says you're overreacting. Margaret almost laughed. Instead, she said quietly, I have spent my whole life reacting quietly so others could be comfortable. I am done with that. The line went silent. That night, Margaret sat alone in the living room, the lamp casting a soft glow. She thought about the word revenge. It was an ugly word, often misunderstood. For her, it did not mean hurting anyone. It meant reclaiming what had been taken: her voice, her agency, her dignity. But revenge, she knew, had roots, and hers were tangled deep in old trauma she had never faced head-on. She thought of the man who had once told her no one would believe her, the man whose shadow had followed her for years. Even after he was gone, she had survived him by staying silent, by shrinking. But survival was not the same as healing. And now, here she was again, being told she didn't know what was best for herself. Something inside her hardened. Margaret began to write again, not in the old journal, but on fresh paper. She wrote letters she did not intend to send. She wrote truths she had swallowed for decades. She wrote about fear, about shame, about the quiet rage of being dismissed again and again because she was a woman, because she was old, because people thought she would not fight back. The words poured out, messy and raw. When her hand cramped, she rested and continued. Each sentence felt like a breath she had been holding for years. A week later, Linda showed up unannounced. Margaret opened the door slowly. Linda stood there, perfectly dressed, eyes scanning the house as if already imagining it empty. "We need to talk," Linda said. Margaret stepped aside without a word. They sat in the living room. Linda wasted no time. "I've found a buyer," she said. "It's a good offer. We should move quickly." Margaret looked at her calmly. "No." Linda's jaw tightened. "You're being unreasonable." Margaret leaned forward slightly. "You don't get to decide that." Linda laughed, a sharp sound. "Do you really think you can handle this alone? Lawyers, finances, paperwork. This isn't your world anymore." Margaret felt the old urge to retreat, to apologize, to make things smooth. Instead, she stayed still. "I handled worse," she said quietly. Linda stood abruptly. "Fine. If you want to make this ugly, we can make it ugly." As the door slammed behind her, Margaret's heart pounded. Fear flickered, but it did not take over. For the first time in her life, she understood something clearly. She was not afraid of Linda. She was afraid of being that silent girl again, and she refused to go back. Late that night, Margaret took out the old journal once more. She opened to a page she had never been able to reread. Her breath caught, but she did not look away. "This is where it began," she whispered. If she was going to protect herself now, she had to confront everything she had buried, not just for revenge, but for freedom. And so, with trembling hands and steady resolve, Margaret began to face the past she had survived but never truly escaped. Margaret did not rush into the past all at once. She learned long ago that memories, when forced open too quickly, could wound just as deeply as the events themselves. Instead, she approached them the way she approached everything now: slowly, deliberately, with control. Each evening, after the house grew quiet, she sat at the small desk by the window, the old journal open in front of her, and allowed herself to read only a few pages at a time. The words were hers, but they felt written by someone else, a younger woman, a frightened one. She could almost see her in the reflection of the darkened window, shoulders hunched, pen shaking, afraid that even the paper might betray her. She remembered the night that had changed everything with a clarity that still made her chest tighten. She had been barely 19, full of plans and certainty then. She trusted easily, too easily. The memory came back not as one scene, but as fragments, a voice too close to her ear, a door closing, the smell of alcohol, The moment when she realized her no longer mattered. She closed the journal and pressed her palm flat against the desk. Grounding herself in the present, she reminded herself that she was not there anymore, that she had survived. But survival had come at a cost. She had told no one, not her parents, not her friends, not even the man who would later become her husband. She had wrapped the trauma around herself like armor, heavy and suffocating, believing it was the only way to keep going. And for years, it worked on the outside. Inside, it festered as the days passed. Margaret noticed how often that old fear had shaped her choices. Why she avoided conflict, why she apologized too quickly, why she allowed people to speak over her, decide for her, dismiss her. The pattern was so clear now it made her ache with both grief and anger. I was protecting myself, she said aloud one evening, but I forgot I was allowed to protect my future too. Meanwhile, Linda did not stay quiet. Letters arrived first, formal and cold, hinting at legal steps. Then came calls from numbers Margaret didn't recognize, people speaking carefully about options, compromises, what was reasonable. She listened politely, then said the same thing every time. No. The firmness in her own voice surprised her. It sounded strong, unshakable. David came to see her the following weekend. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the familiar room like a stranger's. You look tired, he said. So do you, Margaret replied gently. They sat at the kitchen table where he had once done his homework, where she had kissed scraped knees and listened to teenage heartbreaks. For a moment, she almost reached for him the way she used to, almost softened. Why are you doing this? He asked finally. Why are you making things so hard? Margaret met his gaze. Why do you think I owe you obedience just because I am old? He flinched. That's not fair. No, she agreed. It's honest. He sighed, rubbing his face. Linda says you're being emotional. Margaret felt a flicker of pain at his choice of words, then let it pass. I am being rational and emotional. I am allowed to be both. He looked at her, really looked, perhaps for the first time in years. She's worried about you. Margaret leaned back slightly. No, she's worried about what she can't control. Silence stretched between them. There are things you don't know about me, Margaret said quietly. David frowned. Like what? She hesitated. For decades, she had protected him from her past, believing that silence was love. But now she wondered if that silence had taught him the wrong lesson, that his mother was fragile, that she needed managing. There are reasons I don't surrender easily, she said. Reasons I survived. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Mom, you're scaring me. She smiled sadly. Good. That means you're finally seeing me. After he left, Margaret cried for the first time in weeks. Not from fear, but from the weight of everything she had held alone. She cried for the girl she had been, for the woman she had forced herself to become, and for the mother who had believed endurance was the same as strength. But when the tears stopped, something remained: clarity. Margaret knew now that this fight was not just about a house. It was about reclaiming authority over her own life, and that meant one thing above all: truth. She made another appointment, this time with a therapist recommended to her by the same calm voice she had spoken to earlier. Sitting in that small office, with its soft lighting and quiet walls, Margaret felt the old instinct to minimize, to say she was fine, to move on. Instead, she spoke. But first, the words came haltingly, then faster, then all at once. She spoke of the night she had never named, of the years of silence, of how easily people mistook her quiet for consent. She spoke of Linda, of David, of how being dismissed now reopened wounds she had never allowed to heal. The therapist did not interrupt. She did not question. She believed when Margaret left, her legs felt weak, but her chest felt lighter than it had in decades. That night, she opened her old journal and wrote a final entry. "I was never weak," she wrote. "I was surviving in a world that punished women for speaking. I forgive myself for that, but I will not stay silent anymore." The next confrontation came sooner than expected. Linda arrived again, this time with papers in hand and impatience in her eyes. "This can still be simple," she said, placing the folder on the table. "Sign these, and we move forward." Margaret did not touch the papers. "I won't." Linda's voice sharpened. "Do you know how ridiculous you look, fighting like this at your age?" Margaret stood slowly. "Do you know how many times I was told to be quiet because it was easier for others?" Linda scoffed. "This isn't about feelings." "No," Margaret agreed. "It's about power." Linda's face flushed. "You think you're clever. Now, you think writing letters and making calls changes anything." Margaret smiled, small but steady. "I think you underestimate me." Linda leaned in, lowering her voice. "You will lose." Margaret met her gaze without flinching. "I already lost once. A long time ago. I survived it. You don't scare me." For a moment, something flickered across Linda's face in certainty. Perhaps. Then she gathered her papers sharply and left. Margaret sat back down, her heart racing, hands trembling. But beneath the adrenaline was something unfamiliar and powerful. Pride. That night, she slept deeply for the first time in years. She dreamed not of hiding, but of standing in the open, sunlight on her face, her voice carrying without fear. And when she woke, she knew the hardest part was still ahead. The truth she had reclaimed would not stay contained forever. It would demand to be heard, to be acknowledged, and when it was, it would change everything. Margaret sensed the shift before it fully arrived. It came not as chaos, but as a tightening in the air, the way a storm announces itself long before the first drop of rain. She knew Linda would not back down easily. People who were used to control rarely did. And people who underestimated quiet women were often the most dangerous when they realized their mistake. The official letter arrived on a Tuesday morning. Margaret read it slowly, her tea cooling beside her. Legal language, carefully chosen, informing her of an intent to pursue guardianship. The word made her stomach drop. Guardianship meant someone else deciding where she lived, how her money was spent, what she was allowed to do. It was erasure disguised as care. She folded the letter neatly and placed it on the table. "So this is how you want to play it," she whispered. Fear rose, sharp and familiar, but it did not stay in control for long. Margaret had been afraid before, truly afraid, and she had survived. This was different. This time, she was not alone. This time, she was prepared. She made a series of phone calls that day, each one deliberate. Her lawyer confirmed what she already suspected. Linda's case was weak. Margaret was mentally sound, financially stable, and fully capable of making her own decisions. The threat of guardianship was a tactic, meant to scare her into compliance. "They are counting on you." "Backing down," the lawyer said. Margaret smiled faintly. "I won't." In the days that followed, Linda's behavior became erratic. Some messages were syrupy, offering compromise. Others were cold, nearly threatening. David called again, his voice strained. She's saying you're not well, he said. She's worried people will think we're neglecting you. Margaret closed her eyes. Do you think that? Silence. That silence is your answer, she said gently. David's voice broke. I don't know what to do anymore. Margaret softened, but she did not retreat. You can start by listening. The court date was set for the following month. Margaret marked it on her calendar with steady hands. Instead of dread, she felt something close to resolve. Every day became preparation, not just legal, but emotional. She continued therapy, peeling back layers she had never allowed herself to examine. She spoke about shame, about how trauma taught her to disappear. And, slowly, she learned to recognize the difference between vulnerability and weakness. One was human. The other was a lie imposed by those who benefited from her silence. One afternoon, while organizing old documents for her lawyer, Margaret found something unexpected: a police report she had never submitted, written in her own handwriting decades ago. She remembered drafting it in the days after the assault, hands shaking, heart pounding, before folding it away and deciding not to file it. At the time, she had been afraid of being blamed, afraid of not being believed, afraid of ruining her future. Now, holding it in her hands, she felt a wave of grief for the young woman who had carried that fear alone. You deserved better, she whispered. She did not know yet what she would do with that report, but she knew it mattered. It was proof not just of what had happened, but of her truth. As the court date approached, tension with Linda escalated. The final confrontation came unexpectedly, late one evening, when Margaret heard a knock at her door. Opening it, she found Linda standing there, eyes blazing. This ends now, Linda said, stepping inside without invitation. You're humiliating us. Margaret closed the door calmly. You humiliated yourself. Linda laughed bitterly. Do you think anyone will believe you? An old woman claiming independence when everyone can see she's confused. Margaret felt the sting of the words, but she did not flinch. You confuse obedience with sanity. Linda's voice dropped. I will take everything if I have to. Margaret met her gaze, her voice steady. You will not take my house. You will not take my voice. And you will not rewrite my life to suit your convenience. For a moment, the room felt charged, electric. Then Linda's anger cracked, revealing something else beneath it: fear. Margaret recognized it instantly. It was the fear of being exposed, of losing control. You don't know what you're doing, Linda said more quietly. I know exactly what I'm doing, Margaret replied. I am choosing myself. Linda left without another word. The night before the hearing, Margaret sat alone in her living room, the same room where she had once felt so small. She looked around, letting memories surface without overwhelming her. The laughter, the arguments, the quiet nights. This house had held her through everything. She took out the old police report and her journal and placed them side by side. For years, these had been symbols of her silence. Now, they felt like anchors. She did not know if she would share them in court, but knowing she could felt powerful. The courtroom the next day was smaller than she had imagined. Sterile, impersonal. Linda sat across from her, composed, confident. David sat beside her, eyes downcast. When Margaret was asked to speak, she stood slowly, feeling every eye on her. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice did not. I am here because someone decided my age made me invisible, she said. Because they believed they could speak over me, decide for me, erase me politely. She paused, meeting the judge's eyes. I am not confused. I am not helpless. I am a woman who survived things that taught her to be quiet, and I am done being quiet." The room was silent. She spoke of her life, of her independence, of her ability to manage her affairs. She spoke of the house, not as an asset, but as a home. She did not cry. She did not beg. She told the truth. When the ruling came, it was swift. The request for guardianship was denied. Linda's face went pale. David looked stunned. Margaret sat back down, heart pounding, a strange calm washing over her. She had won, but the victory felt like more than legal success. As she stepped outside into the sunlight, Margaret realized something profound. This was not the end of her story. It was the moment her silence finally lost its power. Margaret expected relief to arrive all at once, like a wave breaking after a long storm. She thought the moment the ruling was spoken, the weight would fall away and leave her light, maybe even joyful. But healing, she was learning, did not move that way. It came in quieter steps, in moments that surprised her with their gentleness. The days after the hearing felt strangely still. The phone stopped ringing. No messages from Linda. No carefully worded emails from lawyers. The silence was different. Now not the suffocating kind she had lived with for years, but a spacious one, full of possibility. David came by 3 days later. Margaret saw his car pull into the driveway and felt a familiar tightening in her chest. She considered not answering the door, not because she was afraid, but because she was tired. Tired of explaining herself, tired of carrying other people's discomfort. But then she reminded herself of something important. Choosing herself did not mean closing her heart completely. She opened the door. He looked smaller somehow, his confidence stripped away, replaced with something raw and uncertain. "Can we talk?" he asked. She nodded and stepped aside. They sat in the living room, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. David stared at his hands for a long time before speaking. "I didn't protect you," he said quietly. "I should have." Margaret felt the word settle in her chest, heavy but honest. "You didn't see what was happening," she replied. "And I didn't show you." He swallowed hard. "Linda," she was so sure. "She made it sound like you were slipping away, like I was failing you if I didn't step in." Margaret studied her son's face, searching for the boy she had raised. She found him there, beneath the fear and confusion. "When someone speaks loudly and confidently," she said gently, "it's easy to mistake that for truth." David nodded, tears pooling in his eyes. "I'm sorry." She reached across the space between them and took his hand. It felt like crossing a bridge she had been afraid might collapse. "I don't need you to rescue me," she said. "I need you to respect me." "I do," he said quickly. "I will." They sat in silence after that, the kind that didn't demand fixing. When he left, Margaret felt a quiet sense of closure, not complete, but enough. Linda never came back. Margaret heard through others that the loss of control unsettled her deeply, that she spoke of betrayal and injustice, casting herself as the victim. Margaret listened without reaction. Linda's story was no longer hers to carry. What surprised Margaret most in the weeks that followed was how her body began to respond to the change. She slept better. Her appetite returned. Even the constant ache in her shoulders eased, as if her muscles were finally allowed to rest after decades of bracing. She continued therapy, not because she was broken, but because she was becoming. Each session uncovered layers of grief she had never allowed herself to feel, grief for the girl who had been silenced, for the woman who had endured quietly, for the years spent believing that survival was the highest goal. One afternoon, her therapist asked gently, What does revenge mean to you now? Margaret thought for a long moment. It means not letting the past decide who I am anymore, she said. It means living loudly enough that my silence no longer defines me. She began to make small changes. She joined a local community group, something she would have avoided before. She spoke up during meetings, her voice steady even when her heart raced. She told her story, not all of it, not at first, but enough to let others see her as she truly was. One evening, a younger woman approached her after a meeting, eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you," she said. "I thought I was the only one who felt like that." Margaret went home that night and cried, not from pain, but from connection. The old journal stayed on her desk, no longer hidden away. Sometimes she opened it and read the early entries, not to relive them, but to honor the strength it had taken to survive. Other times, she wrote new pages about peace, about anger, about joy, about the strange beauty of beginning again at an age when the world expected her to be winding down. One morning, while cleaning out a drawer, she found the police report she had written decades ago. She held it for a long time, considering what it represented. In the end, she placed it back in the drawer, not as a secret, but as a reminder. She did not need to prove her pain anymore. She knew it was real. On the anniversary of the court ruling, Margaret hosted a small gathering at her house. Friends from the community group came. Neighbors she had known for years, but never truly spoken to, filled the rooms with laughter and warmth. David came too, alone this time, his presence quieter, more respectful. As the sun set, Margaret stood in her kitchen, watching people she cared about move through her home. This house, once threatened, now felt alive in a way it never had before. Someone raised a glass and toasted her. To Margaret, they said, for her courage. She smiled, humbled and a little embarrassed. To truth, she replied, and to not disappearing. Later that night, after everyone had gone, Margaret sat alone in her favorite chair. The house was quiet again, but it was a friendly quiet now, filled with echoes of voices and footsteps. She thought about the word trauma, how it had shaped so much of her life without ever being spoken aloud. She thought about revenge, how it had transformed from something sharp and angry into something softer, stronger. Revenge, she realized, was not about making others suffer. It was about refusing to suffer in silence anymore. Margaret stood and walked to the mirror in the hallway. She looked at her reflection, the white hair, the lined face, the eyes that had seen too much and survived it all. "You did it," she whispered to herself. "You're free." And for the first time in her life, she believed it.